Yeah.
But what he's saying is that this pleasure of mind expansion for an intellectual person is greater than that pleasure. And actually, I've said this as a joke once on a couple of occasions when I've received a new book. I told my friends, this is better than a new wife. This book is better than a new wife. I've just learned so much from this book, and it's expanded my horizons beyond what I could have imagined. And so there are certain books that have really changed my life at an intellectual level. Alhamdulillah. Now, موصل الطلاب إلى قواعد الإعراب by Khalid Al-Azhari totally changes the way that anyone will view the jar and majroor. It's like you've studied it at one level in the grammar books, in the practical grammar, in the theoretical grammar books, and then he gives you a different perspective on exactly what it means and how you can interpret it, the jar and the majroor, in different ways, in different scenarios. And it's just a complete mind expansion. So that's something, for example, in Arabic.
And who would have thought jar and majroor could be better than a new wife?
Yes, alhamdulillah.
That's the first time for me.
Something
ومن ينفق الساعات في جمع ماله مخافة فقر فالذي فعل الفقر وإذا ظلمت فإن ظلمي باسل مر مذاقته كطعم العلقم ألم تعلمي أني إذا الضيف نابني وعز القرى أقري السديف المسرهدة.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Arabic Qahwa podcast. And in this one, we have an interview. I know the past couple of episodes, or many of the episodes, has been just me talking. And I've been thinking things have been getting a bit boring lately. So I found someone very interesting for you, inshallah. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ustad Moustafa Elqabbany, who is a professional translator and also a poet. Ahlan wa sahlan, Ustad Moustafa, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today.
Ahlan bikum, and thank you for having me. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Hayyakum Allah, ya marhaba. And I had the pleasure of working together with Ustad Moustafa on a very special project. So if you have been following me on Facebook or on any of the social media channels, I'm sure you've seen me post a lot about this new project that we have been working on together. We have translated, alhamdulillah, the poem of Abu Ishaq Al-Ilbiri, rahimahullah, which is a very beneficial poem, and it deals with, the benefits of seeking knowledge, and it has some really beautiful advice on leading a really purposeful life. And I feel that this poem, which Ustad Moustafa has, produced a really wonderful translation for, is something very special. So I wanted to share some parts of this beautiful work with you. I wanted to give some glimpses of this wonderful poem to you. And I thought, who better to share this with you than the translator himself. So that is why I wanted to invite Ustad Moustafa over to the podcast, and he has accepted very graciously. So Ustad Moustafa, I want to invite you to share some parts of the poem which you feel are worth reflecting upon, and I think you will be the best judge of what parts we should really look at and ponder upon, inshallah.
Inshallah. So first of all, I wanted to thank you once again for having me and for giving me the opportunity to translate this poem. So this poem is about virtue, about living a purposeful life, about acquiring knowledge, about directing oneself toward the akhirah, and abandoning attachment to the dunya.
Yes.
Abandoning emotional or spiritual or psychological attachment to the dunya. Now, there are very few lessons in spirituality and in taqwa that I apply. And one of the only ones that I do apply is that when it comes to spirituality, that one should never speak about something unless one has experienced it. One should never speak about spiritual matters or religious matters unless one personally has experienced it or experiences it. And so because of that, I'm not going to talk very much about taqwa because I don't feel qualified, but I will talk about some other issues in the poem that resonate with me personally regarding the imminence and the realization of the approach of death, and also the benefits of acquiring knowledge. So the poem begins with something that resonates with a lot of people, and in particular with people who are well into their 40s. Now, I'm not saying it's not of benefit to people who are in their 20s or younger even, but as we all know, people who are in their 20s don't really necessarily feel that the approach of death, and perhaps not even this great disappointment with the dunya, which never fails to disappoint. And so the poet begins in a very poignant way. He says, تفت فؤادك الأيام فتى وتنحت جسمك الساعات نحتا. The passing of days crushes your heart into crumbs, and hours carve away at your body. Now, a typical person who's over 40, such as myself, has experienced the death of loved ones, has experienced job loss, financial fears.
If I may just ask a question, Ustad Moustafa.
Many different situations. Yes.
Yes. There is this. I had this impression that this poem is directed towards someone who is young, because
it is.
He addresses someone named Abu Bakr, who is apparently a young person. So, do you feel that this applies to older people as well?
Absolutely. So the poem is addressed to a young man with the hopes that he will be wise enough to realize the truth of what's in it. And there's no doubt that the poem contains a lot of truth. However, knowing something at the intellectual level is different from experiencing it. When you're young and people say, we all die, you think, yeah, well, I mean, we all die, and the sun is in the sky, and trees grow leaves, and these are all truths that we accept, but you don't really quite realize it because you haven't experienced it. And so there's no doubt that if a young person were to internalize what's in this poem, that it would benefit them greatly. But an older person, when they first read this opening line, can feel it, not just understand it. That the passing of days crushes your heart. When you've had, people have seen their parents pass away, a brother or sister pass away, even their children pass away, job loss, fears of poverty, insecurity regarding what's going to happen when I move from this country to that country, and basically a general understanding that really, as a human being, I have, and as a living creature in this universe, I have very little say in what goes on, and that, and there's a lot of understanding that from Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, that there is no permanence and there is no security in it. And even when you think, okay, well, you know what, I can accomplish this, I can overcome, I can defeat these problems. And then you have trouble going for sujood sometimes because your body doesn't react the same way it used to. Right? You've become physically weaker even. And so while this poem is directed towards a young man, when an older person, a middle-aged person first reads this line, it hits one. تَفُتُّ فُؤَادَكَ الْأَيَّامُ فَتَّى. The passing of days crushes. It's actively crushing your heart so that you no longer have any attachment. You no longer have a feeling that there is permanence in this dunya. وَتَنْحِتُ جِسْمَكَ السَّاعَاتُ نَحْتًا, and not just your heart, but even your body begins to fail you.
Subhanallah.
And so it's quite a great reminder.
Subhanallah. It's a very
another part of the
that's a powerful way of looking at it. When you have that experience and you feel the weight of all those years.
Yes.
Please go on. Yes.
Another section of the poem that I really liked. So another part of the poem that I really liked was when the author, rahimahullah, says, describing knowledge. He says, وَكَنْزٌ لَا تَخَافُ عَلَيْهِ لِصًّا خفيف الحمل يوجد حيث كنت يزيد بكثرة الإنفاق منه وينقص إن به كفا شددت. No one can take knowledge away from you by, for example, by someone close to you dying, by taking away your money, by taking away your home, by becoming old. The knowledge that you have acquired remains with you. So it is a treasure for which you fear no thieves. It's a light burden that is found wherever you may be, wherever you are. If you are, even if you are in solitary confinement, may Allah protect us all, but even if you're in solitary confinement or wherever you might be, you still have that knowledge with you, and you can still contemplate and still understand what is going on and reflect. And so knowledge benefits you. So there are many. If we go slowly and dissect these two verses, we find that he mentions at least 3 benefits of knowledge. One of them is that it can't be taken away from you. Okay. The second is that it's with you wherever you go. So even if you're alone, even if you have no one to talk to, you can have, and of course there are spiritual benefits of knowledge. But as I said, I'm not going to talk about spirituality, but rather I'm going to say that even as an intelligent person, even if you're alone, you can have that conversation with yourself, and you can examine, and you can have potential. You can have a conversation, heart and your mind, even if you're sitting alone, by having that conversation with yourself, by reviewing knowledge, by expanding that knowledge, and we'll talk about that more later in another part of the verse. So the second, or another part of the poem, the second part of the second benefit rather that's mentioned here is that when you're alone, even even if you're alone, that you can benefit from your own knowledge. نعم خفيف الحمل يوجد حيث كنت. It's there with you wherever you go. The third one that he mentions is يزيد بكثرة الإنفاق منه. It increases the more you spend of it. It is verifiable that spending from your knowledge, that spreading knowledge, doesn't decrease your knowledge, but rather increases your knowledge. Why? I've taught English as a second language, among other things that I've taught. And what I find is that whenever I teach a subject, the people who don't know that subject, my students, ask me questions that force me to see connections that I had never known before. Right. And so, for example, I was having a conversation with a coworker, and by chat. At work, we communicate by chat sometimes. And she asked me about a particular scholar, but she didn't write the word scholar correctly. She actually wrote it as schooler. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I had never seen the connection between scholar and school before until she miswrote the word. Right? And this has happened several times. For example, I hadn't seen the connection between the word didactic and education until someone pointed it out to me, someone who doesn't really speak English. And this has happened several times, that people who don't know English well ask me questions and ask me if things are related, and then I begin to see the connections. And so so teaching increases one's knowledge because the students, despite their ignorance, will see connections that someone who knows the subject very well has not seen, because they know it so well that they stopped observing it. It's just the same way, for example, that if you walk into a room and you see a little boy and a group of men, you might be able to say, this boy is that man's father.
Mhm.
And even though the boy's father might not see that the boy resembles him, but you see it because you've come as an outsider.
Mhm.
And this is similar to the way that so there were two schools of Islamic grammar in the early days of the development of grammar. There was the Basran school from Basra in Iraq,
Yes.
and there was the Kufan school from Kufa, also in Iraq. The Kufan school was developed by Arabs, or primarily Arabs, and the Basran school was developed primarily by Persians.
Okay.
The Basran school survived.
Okay.
And the Kufan school pretty much died out. Why? The Persians had multiple advantages. One of them is that they had an ancient intellectual tradition, and one could say similar to a madrasa tradition, although it was used for Zoroastrianism and Persian philosophy, not for Islam. But they had this academic tradition built in. But also another issue is that the Persians looked at Arabic from the outside,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the Arabs were stuck inside of the Arabic language, right? So an outsider often has a perspective that an insider doesn't see, or that an insider misses. And so teaching people who are far less knowledgeable, but still enthusiastic and intelligent, actually benefits the teacher himself or herself.
Yeah. So about the two verses you just talked about. So I think there's also a comparison here between wealth and knowledge. Is that right? Because he's comparing materialistic wealth and
absolutely
knowledge. So that's also a benefit here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because he says if you have money, then you have to worry about it getting stolen and losing this money. As for knowledge, you're never going to lose it.
Absolutely.
And it's khafif al-haml. You can carry it anywhere with you. And the second point also shows you that knowledge is the opposite of money, because when it comes to money, the more you spend it, the more it reduces. But for knowledge, as you explained, the more you spend it, the more it increases. So that's also a very striking comparison.
Jazakumullah khairan. Yes.
Between the two. Subhanallah. Yeah. Please go on.
Yes, of course. So there are just two more sections that I wanted to talk about, or two more verses. They're not contiguous verses.
Yeah.
One of them is just a brilliant observation. He says, describing the dunya, وَتُطْعِمُكَ الطَّعَامَ وَعَنْ قَرِيبٍ سَتَطْعَمُ مِنْكَ مَا مِنْهَا طَعِمْتَ. And it's so concise and eloquent in Arabic. The English can't really match it, but he's talking about this world, this dunya. He says it gives you food. وَتُطْعِمُكَ الطَّعَامَ. It feeds you food. وَعَنْ قَرِيبٍ. Soon, whatever you ate while with it, it will now take from you and eat. Your entire flesh, your entire being will be consumed by the earth. So, and whatever we eat, it comes out in a few different ways. If it comes out in terms of waste, that already goes into the soil and into the water supply. And then finally, when we will become waste, and we will be buried in the earth, and instead of asking what's for lunch, we will be lunch for the worms and for the insects, and eventually for trees. We will become the nutrients that go into the grass, that go into plants. And so the world, or to use modern parlance, nature, will eat us after we have eaten from it.
Subhanallah.
And so it's quite a humbling observation.
Yeah. Subhanallah, whatever you take, you're going to give it
the
back.
last no,
So true.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. No. And I'll just close with this observation, where the author says, rahimahullah, وَمَهْمَا افْتَضَّ أبكار الغواني فكم بكر من الحكم افتضبت. That however many beautiful virgins, so you imagine some rich guy who maybe he's out of control, every so many years he goes and marries a new young woman, and so he says, and however many beautiful virgins he's deflowered or has slept with. So the author is basically saying that even for example, though a rich person, someone who's for example rich but empty, may go around every couple of years marrying a new young woman and getting his enjoyment out of that. And he uses this image of deflowering virgins. He says, how many virgin aphorisms have you deflowered? How many times have you experienced mind expansion because of something that you've read or something that you've discovered upon reflecting upon what you've read and applying what you've read? And so there are the idea is that the joy that one gets out of sometimes a new book or just a new idea is greater than the joy of any physical pleasure. So he uses the greatest physical pleasure possible, which is, for a man marrying a new young woman. Yeah. There's anyone who denies that that's a great pleasure is just lying to themselves and is trying to act, holier than thou. It's a great pleasure. Yeah. But what he's saying is that this pleasure of mind expansion for an intellectual person is greater than that pleasure. And actually, I've said this as a joke once on a couple of occasions. When I've received a new book, I told my friends, this is better than a new wife. This book is better than a new wife. I've just learned so much from this book, and it's expanded my horizons beyond what I could have imagined. And so there are certain books that have really changed my life at an intellectual level. Alhamdulillah. There was a for example, a book like موصل الطلاب إلى قواعد الإعراب.
We'll put them in the show notes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
نعم. موصل الطلاب إلى قواعد الإعراب by Khalid Al-Azhari totally changes the way that anyone will view the jar and majroor. It's like you've studied it at one level in the grammar books, in the practical grammar, in the theoretical grammar books, and then he gives you a different perspective on exactly what it means and how you can interpret it, the jar and the majroor, in different ways, in different scenarios. And it's just a complete mind expansion. So that's something, for example, in Arabic.
And who would have thought jar and majroor could be better than a new wife?
Yes, alhamdulillah.
That's the first time for me.
Something at the, alhamdulillah. Even something at the level of that was written in English, which was the Routledge Encyclopedia of Arabic Literature. Okay. It's a useful reference for anyone who's interested in Arabic literature and what have you. Okay. They have an article on prosody in there. Okay. And prosody is basically the study of Arabic poetic meter and rhyme. Yes. And as I mentioned earlier, if you notice there were two schools of Arabic grammar early on. Yes. The Basran school, which was dominated by Persians, and the Kufan school, which was dominated by Arabs. Yeah. And the Arabs and the Kufan school essentially died out, and the modern school is basically the Basran school. Yeah. Give or take a few issues. Now, if we look at prosody in Arabic, the one who invented it was Al-Khalil bin Ahmed Al-Farahidi, who was an Arab. Yes. And basically, you know how the ancient Egyptians, they say, would kind of read these spells over their treasures so that no one could open them up, or so that whoever would open them up would be cursed, right? Yeah. And so Al-Farahidi, he was brilliant, but his explanation of arud is so difficult
I see.
that it was never really modified by anyone other than Al-Akhfash later on,
Okay.
because it was such a complicated discipline. Now, I had tried and tried
Yeah.
to understand Arabic prosody the traditional way, but it's so full of Bedouin terminology, terminology related to the desert lifestyle that he's applying to poetry. And he didn't even rahimahullah, Imam Khalil didn't even use syllables. He used multisyllabic clusters in his explanation, a sabab and a watad and what have you. I just couldn't master it. Then someone came to me, and it reminded me of the story of the muhaddithin with Abu Hanifa, where sometimes a muhaddith would come with a hadith to Abu Hanifa, and the muhaddith wouldn't understand the hadith, but he would tell the hadith to Abu Hanifa, and Abu Hanifa would explain it to him. So this person came to me with an article. I told him I really wanted to understand prosody, but was facing some difficulties. This person, may Allah bless him, I won't mention him in case he doesn't want to be known by name. He gave me a photocopy of the entry on prosody from the Routledge Encyclopedia of Arabic Literature. When I read it, I remember very clearly. My wife had appointments at in the doctor's office. While I was waiting at the doctor's office, I'd be sitting reading the document. I'd be reading it before work. I'd be reading it during my breaks at work. I'd be reading it after work. For 4 days, I read this article over and over again, and that's it. I became a poet after that. Now, I was a poet in English before that, but never in Arabic. After that, at the age of 39, so anyone who thinks that they're too old to learn should consider that I didn't really know Arabic poetry or the meter of Arabic poetry before I was 39. So at the age of 39, I read this. It was an incredible eureka moment. I now knew how Arabic prosody worked, and went ahead and started composing poems. And so that was also, even though it's written by non-Muslims, but nonetheless, it helped me analyze and understand things that are relevant to Islam, because Arabic poetry, including especially Jahili poetry, learning it is a fard kifaya, because it is the language that was used by that was used in the Quran and the Sunnah. So understanding Jahili poetry, the poetry of the Jahiliyyah, is actually incredibly important to understanding the Quran.
I've heard the poetry till 150 Hijri is considered as an authority to understand the text of the Quran and the Hadith. Because
150 Hijri. 150 Hijri is when what they call Asr al-Ihtijaj ended. So Asr al-Ihtijaj is like the authoritative era where Arabs were still strong enough in Arabic to be able to quote them.
So if we take a word from the Quran and we want to study the exact meaning, we'll bring poetry to establish that meaning. We'll use the poetry as proof to say this is what the word means exactly. Am I right?
Absolutely. So that's used quite a bit. And it's not just that, it's also to understand. See, the thing is that many of our understandings of words in the Quran have been Islamicized. And that's not a bad thing, but it's nonetheless, it means that we are not able to hear the Quran the same way as the original Sahaba heard it, because they didn't have the Islamicized terminology yet. That came after they became Muslims. So, for example, I'll give you a simple example. There's a hadith where a group of the Sahaba were out on an expedition looking for water or food, and they found a woman who had 2 large water skins, and they told her, "Ji'naki min 'indi Rasulillah." Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We have come to you from the Messenger of Allah. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. What was her response? She said, "Ma Rasulullah." What is the Messenger of Allah? So she understood all the words. She understood what Rasul meant. She knew that kings, being an Arab, she knew that kings and important people had Rasul, had messengers. And she obviously knew who Allah was, but she didn't get
Yeah.
What is Rasulullah? What does that even
Subhanallah.
mean? Rasul, Allah has a messenger?
Yeah.
And so when we hear words like taqwa,
Yeah.
we think, oh, that means piety.
Yeah.
But taqwa was used to mean physical protection at one point. We hear words like afu, afu, which means pardon. But Imru al-Qais in his poetry uses it to mean when winds cause sand to blow over so that you no longer see the effects or the artifacts of a campsite. We see words. Do we realize, for example, that the word ghafara and kafara are actually close in meaning? Ghafara and kafara both mean to cover. And so ghafara is to cover a sin, and kafara is to cover the truth.
So what you're saying is,
right?
there are levels to the meanings of the words.
Yes.
When you just read the English translation of the word, you just see the outer layer of the meaning. But when you learn poetry and you go deeper into the meaning, you understand a lot more. So, I hear these students, they say things like, I've been learning Arabic for 1 year now. Alhamdulillah, I understand 80% of the Quran. And when I hear this, subhanAllah, I can relate to this because I used to say this when I learned Arabic for a year and a half. And I felt like I've been understanding 80% of the Quran when I read it. But now when I've been learning for some more time, I started saying, now I understand only 70%. Then after a while, I start saying I understand only 60%. Because I'm starting to see more and more layers to these words, subhanAllah. So when you go